Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the MIT Alumni Scotch Tasting Tour of Islay. My name is Kevin McCumber. I'm MIT class of 2005, undergraduate 2011 PhD. I organize food and beverage tastings for the MIT Club of Boston that are open to all alumni now through our virtual platform. I'm really excited about this event. Laphroaig 10 is actually the Scotch that got me into Scotch. So it's a pleasure to have Simon here with us tonight to talk about that, as well as some other whiskeys that we will compare and contrast over the course of the evening. I want to thank the MIT Club of Boston for continuing to support our food and beverage events, as well as the other MIT clubs across the country and around the world who help publicize it. The MIT Alumni Association, especially Kim Hunter, who's a big help in a lot of things behind the scenes. And I'd also like to thank Beam Centauri, and especially Simon and Tucker for all of their help making this event possible, and especially with a lot of logistics around getting those tasting kits out to those of us in the Boston area. 110 kits went out. So it was a pretty big undertaking to be able to distribute those over the course of a couple of days. I would really like to thank as well, you all, our alumni, especially those who donated to the MIT COVID-19 response funds. As you know, we collected donations for the kits, and I'm happy to say we collected over $6,700 in donations for the kits alone. And I know that there were many more of you who donated without the expectation of even getting a kit. So thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you for continuing to come to these events. And I hope to be able to put these on for us for as long as possible to keep bringing us together and keep tasting some good things. All right. I'm going to get started just with a quick agenda for the evening. I'll do a brief introduction to Simon before I hand it over to him. He's then going to walk us through the preparation of the Bobby Burns cocktail, and then he'll take us on our tasting tour of Islay, which will include the whiskey tasting of the 4 recommended whiskeys for the evening, as well as a moderated Q&A session. Then we'll conclude with the breakout rooms, and if you're not familiar with breakouts, that's just groups of 5 to 6 of us, small groups randomly assigned, where we get to meet each other face to face as we would in a tasting, and be able to just chat about what we're tasting, what we're experiencing, whiskey in general and life in general. So hopefully making those personal connections that have become a little bit harder to make over the past several months. And no good tasting is complete without an after party. So after the official conclusion of the event, after the breakouts, we'll all come back together. We'll all be able to unmute and chat with each other. And if Simon is able to stick around at all, we'll be able to talk with him as well with any remaining questions or just musings on life that we'd like to, to chat about with him. And yes, this event is being recorded, and that recording will be posted on the MIT Club of Boston's YouTube channel. I'll send out that link after this event in a post-event email that'll have a few other things as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. And as a reminder, this event and all the others in our food and beverage series are in support of MIT's COVID-19 response funds. I know many of you have already donated for this event. Thank you so much. And I encourage you to continue supporting these funds. We're not out of the woods at all on COVID. So thank you for your support going forward as well. If you'd like to ask a question tonight, we're doing that through a third-party portal. Go to meet.ps/MIT Scotch. You can click on the banner that says to submit your question, and then you'll be able to see others submitted questions as well and upvote them. And then I'll just cherry pick the ones that get the most votes. And I'll pose those to Simon along the course of the evening, as well as at the end when we do our moderated Q&A. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to your question and you'd really like to ask it of Simon, in that post-event email, I'll provide his email address, and you'll be able to reach out directly to Simon with any remaining questions that you have. Just an idea of our roadmap coming up. In about a month, we'll have a wine appreciation seminar featuring MIT alumnus Dave Stair, who founded the Dry Creek Vineyard in Sonoma, California, as well as his daughter, Kim, who now runs the vineyard. In late March, we'll be doing a Sake 101 course. And on April 30th, Kentucky Derby Day, we're planning a bourbon masterclass for you. Beyond that, we have some other events in the works. I just not able to officially publicize yet, but keep your eyes open. I do base this roadmap a lot off of what we get in a post-event survey. That survey will be sent out as part of that post-event email. So I encourage you to please take that survey and indicate what types of events you'd like to see in the future. If you'd like to make sure that you don't miss out on any of these events, there's a couple of options. One is to join my private food and beverage email list where I publicize these in advance. And that link to join that will come out in the post-event email. We also now have our own group on Facebook, the MIT Alumni Fine Spirits Society, which was founded, focused mostly on fine spirits like single malt Scotch whiskey, but now we're also broadening out to food and beverage. And I'll send the link for that as well in that post-event email. All right. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Simon Brooking, the Scotch ambassador from Beam Suntory. Just to give you a brief introduction to Simon, Simon started his career actually as an actor, and pretty face turned into something, I guess, a little bit more fun on the Scotch stage, where he got involved with being an ambassador for Scotch whiskey and became a bit of a rock star. So Simon is now world-renowned as the Scotch ambassador for Beam Suntory, and I had the pleasure of meeting Simon in 2011 at an MIT alumni event that I organized, where he was pouring some of his whiskeys there. So here we are 10 years later and many, many whiskeys later, and we're still doing this together, and it's good to have you back leading us into the smoke, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I dreamt a dream the other night. Isla, Isla's away, my John. Peat burning bright and copper stills. Isla's away. Whiskey so sweet, in great demand. Isla, Isla's away, my John. Laphroaig's the best in all the land. Isla's away. Kid Millie Felcher, to all the MIT alumni, I'm Simon Brooking, the Beam Suntory, the Scotch ambassador. I like to sing, I like to drink Scotch, and to quote George Burns, most folks would rather listen to me drink Scotch. It's a bra bricht moonlicht nicht the nicht. It is Burns, Robert Burns season right now, and it's a cold, bright, moonlit night tonight. The wind is blowing hard. It's a good night for drams of whiskey, and we've got a great selection of whiskeys for you to choose from the island of Islay. Some of the early conversation, we got a chance. Some of the folks on the session tonight have already been to Islay and been to Scotland. Fantastic. The rest of you, we're waiting, please. Of course, you may need to wait a little bit longer given the current circumstances, but once the doors are open again to the public, we will welcome you with open arms and a dram ready to warm your hearts. Kevin, really thank you for the welcome, and to you all, this is a lovely evening of whiskey tasting. But before we actually get into the meat of the tasting, we wanted to do a cocktail. And in the spirit of the poet laureate of Scotland, Bobby Burns, we're going to do a Bobby Burns cocktail. So we're going to start off with half an ounce of Benedictine into a glass with ice. Over the ice, you're also going to pour 1 ounce of vermouth and then an ounce of Bowmore 12. We'll then stir. You want to get a nice ratio of spirit to water. And then in a coupe glass, we are going to pour our Bobby Burns cocktail into the coupe glass. And there we are set. We are ready for this evening. Now, something to lubricate the evening as we head over to the island of Islay. And I'll offer a toast May the best you've ever seen be the worst you'll ever see. May a mouse never leave your pantry with a teardrop in his ee. May you all be hale and hearty till you're old enough to dee. May I wish you all the best as I wish you all to be. Slàinte, cheers. Bobby Burns cocktail, folks. Ah, there we are off. Now I am ready. Let me share my screen with you. So, as I was saying, Kinmilly Felcha Gu Alba, which is 100,000 welcomes to Scotland. We are traveling over to Scotland. The easiest way to get there these days is flying, particularly to Islay, flying to Glasgow, because there are direct flights by the Flybe Airlines. We like to call it Fly Maybe, actually, because they're not that reliable. I always say, fly to Glasgow and then drive to the coast and then hop on the ferry. But we are going. Things are a wee bit hairy these days. We like it that way in Scotland. Keeps us warm. If the whiskey doesn't keep us warm, the wool, the hair keeps us warm. Now we call these a hairy coo, right? And that translates to hairy cow or a Highland coo, a Highland cow. They look very friendly, but please do not jump over the fence into the field, because they are not that friendly once encountering head on. The horns are dangerous. Scotland. I know it's a country, a lot of folks think that we are an island unto itself, but we are attached to a country to the south of us, which will remain nameless. But actually, that country came in, was very important for us when it came to whiskey making. When you look at Scotland, the regions will give you the different styles, will give you the different influences of the styles from the regions. The lowlands of Scotland, known as the Garden of Scotland, the whiskies from these regions are very light in style, grain, grassy notes. That comes from the grain grown in these regions. There's a lot of chalk in the water, so they're very dry whiskies. They don't have a long finish to them. You don't need a long finish because it's a milder climate in comparison to when you get up to the north, and particularly along to the west and the islands to the west. We have a distillery from the lowlands, Auchentoshan, located just outside of Glasgow on the road north into the Highlands, just before you reach the Erskine Bridge, the Clyde River Valley. Auchentoshan Distillery, unique because it is the only distillery that triple distills every drop of their whiskey in Scotland. All the other distilleries do what we call double distillation. They're two sets of stills. Well, we triple distill at Auchentoshan, and that gives us unique flavors and a unique opportunity to pull more out of the wood during maturation. You drive north of the Highland line, the land changes, the topography changes, you get more highs and lows in the land, so you get more highs and lows in the whiskies. The Highland style is more of a floral honey notes, and that comes from the heather, which grows predominantly in the Highland regions. We have two distilleries from the Highlands. You can see up into the northeast there, the Aberdeenshire region. We've got Glengeary just outside Aberdeen, and the Ardmore distillery, one of the highest distilleries in Scotland. They are also classically, historically, they also used peat as well. And a lot of folks think that the only peated whiskies come from the island of Islay. Not true. Historically, Ardmore and Glengeary used peat as well, but the peat that they were harvesting was coming from the northeast, not from the islands. And that will give you different flavors, which I'll talk about when we get to it later on. Within the Highlands, you've got a smaller sub-region known as the Speyside region. Many of the distilleries located on the River Spey, hence the name Speyside. Speyside are more herbal in their style in comparison to the floral style of the Highlands. This region came into prominence because the first licensed distillery in Scotland was this tiny wee distillery called Glenlivet. Heard of it? And because of that, all these other distilleries popped up in the valley of the River Livet, many of them calling themselves Glenlivet. And that's why it's known as the Glenlivet, to distinguish itself from all the others that were trying to cash in on that Glenlivet name. The Speysides are more herbal in their style compared to the floral style of the Highlands. They rely on the water. The River Spey is one of the fastest, purest rivers in Scotland. Great salmon fishing. The water's filtering through the hills, the Cairngorm, the granite rock of the Cairngorms. And so water is one of the key ingredients in whiskey making, not only in Scotland, but also around the world. We have the Beam distilleries in Kentucky, and those limestone aquifers are a key reason for the success for the bourbon produced in Kentucky for Beam and the likes of our partners, Maker's Mark as well. And then we've got the islands up north of this map, off this map here. In the Orkneys, you've got the Highland Park and Scapa. And then off to the northwest, we were talking about it a wee bit earlier, the Isle of Skye, you've got Talisker. But where we're going to be concentrating on today, this evening, is the island of Islay. 3,200 people, 9 distilleries. It's also called the Happy Island. We make a lot of whiskey on this island. And actually, historically, during the 18th and early part of the 19th century, there were over 16 distilleries on the island. Now, that seems to be a stray why for this island stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic. Well, it's because it was actually historically and geographically more centrally located, because travel over the mountains took much longer than travel by the waterways, by the rivers, by the sea. So Islay was poised perfectly centrally located to be able to move up and down the coast and from country to country along the channel and beyond. And so Islay has also got a great water source. We get a lot of rain. It's raining 320 days of the year horizontally. Some of you have experienced that. And it's that rain is such that those water sources are so important for us. So when you come to visit Scotland and it's raining, that's a good thing. That's just whiskey waiting to be made. There's one other small portion there, that little pink section just to the right of Islay. That is the Mull of Kintyre, and at the southern tip of the Mull of Kintyre is Campbelltown, and that is a region unto itself as well. Campbelltown at one point in the mid-1800s was the port, the center for whiskey production, because it was a port town. But when the railways came in and the roads got better on the mainland, many of those distilleries in Campbelltown shut down. But its proximity to Northern Ireland, to Ireland itself, is one of the key reasons that whiskey in the early years migrated. The southern tip of the Mull of Kintyre, that pink, just across from Northern Ireland, is 18 miles to Ireland. Just far enough away, but just close enough, if you know what I mean. So if we look at some of the basics, what is single malt Scotch? It's the product of an individual what, made exclusively from what, distilled in what, aged for how long? Well, it's a single malt, has to be made out of pure malted barley, distilled in copper pot stills, aged in oak barrels for a minimum of 3 years by law before it can legally be called a single malt Scotch, and bottled at a minimum of 40% ABV. As I was mentioning, the earliest records we have for Scotch whiskey is 1494. Prior to that, it was the Irish monks that discovered the distillation techniques during the time of the alchemist. They were experimenting with different natural products. Barley was naturally fermenting the field when left fallow. And when you boiled that fermented barley, the liquid it produced, it created this rather ethereal effect. It in essence brought you closer to your God. So when you talk about spirits in its original context, it is those religious origins. So welcome to the Church of Bowmore, the Church of Laphroaig, where all your sins will be absolved. And as the monks traveled, they came across, it's only 34 miles from Islay to Northern Ireland, Ballycastle, Northern Ireland. They brought religion, and they also brought the whiskey making techniques. They taught us how to make it. I know the Irish like to say they invented it. We Scots, we perfected it over the next 800 years. Earliest record, 1494, we have a Friar John Core purchasing 8 bowls of malt to make aquavitae. Scotch whiskey is an akavite. It is a water of life. And the Gaelic word for that is ushkaveha. Ushka meaning water and veha of life. Over the years, it was shortened from ushkaveha just to ushki, and then anglicized ushki morphed into whiskey, ushki whiskey. So when you're ordering whiskey, you're actually ordering water in the Gaelic language. 1505, the Guild of Surgeon Barbers were granted a monopoly to produce and sell ushkaveha as a tonic. So that's when it went from the religious to the commercial. 1642, because of the English Civil War, the Scottish Parliament levied taxes on all the whiskeymen. And this drove them mad, and it drove them up into the Highlands and out to the islands. And that's why we have such a high concentration of distilleries on the island of Islay today, because you can see the tax man coming on his wee rowboat to come collect for the Queen there. So you'd hide those stills where you're making a few extra pennies on the side. By the late 18th century, there were over 16,000 illegal stills all over Scotland. Now, keep in mind, Scotland is smaller than the state of Kentucky. Kentucky today has over 50 distilleries and growing. We have over 130 single malt distilleries and growing. So score one for Scotland on that. But the stills, these are what the stills would have been looking like back in the day. The farmers were the stillmen of the day. It was a way for them with sustenance farming, a way for them to make a few extra pennies on the side. The Johnston brothers, who started the Laphroaig distillery, they were making more money making the whiskey, so they stopped farming, went into whiskey making. Technically, on the bottle it says established 1815, legally 1823. But you made more money at market, and it also gave you a nice spirit to keep you warm during those long, cold winter months. So basically, you've got your pot on the left there. You've made a beer, an 8% beer. You're going to heat it from down below. The vapors will travel up over that swan neck into a condenser coil in the bucket of cold water there. And then you've got your tap on the right just to draw off the new spirit. Pretty easy to do, pretty hard to do consistently. We've been doing it at Bowmore since 1779. But I show you that because the basic design hasn't changed through the years. What has changed is the size to deal with the demand and the popularity of single malt Scotch. You see behind me the still house at Laphroaig Distillery. And these are the other stills, the still houses for the 5 single malt distilleries that we represent at Bean Suntory. Not only Laphroaig and Bowmore, but I mentioned also Glengarry, Ardmore, and Auchentoshan. These are size and shape of the stills are going to be one of the contributing factors to the style of the spirit. The smaller squat stills, similar to what you're going to find with Laphroaig and Bowmore, are going to give you a little bit heavier, oilier body. The taller stills, you're going to get more copper contact, and you're going to get a lighter, sweeter style. So that's what you're going to find with the like of Ardmore, which has some of the largest stills in Scotland. It's all about copper contact. There's a conversation that's happening between the copper and the spirit as it's being distilled. You've got these rolling boils happening in those boil balls in the bottom section of the stills. And that copper contact is going to pull out a lot of the heavier solids while letting the lighter, sweeter parts move up over the swan neck into the condenser. We use shell and tube condensers. The worm tub condensers, as you saw in the small still, are very rarely used anymore because they're harder to gauge temperature-wise, temperature control. So those are the stills. Now let's travel to Islay. Getting to Islay, there have been people on the island of Islay since 4500 BC in the Mesolithic age. Hunter-gatherers. They have found, archaeologists have found middens with fragments of fishing and hunting gear that date back to the 4500 BC. Then you've got the Neolithic age with the first immigrant farmers, and there are standing stones on the island of Islay that date back to 3500 BC, moving then into the Bronze Age, down through the Iron Age, and then 500 AD was the beginning of the Christian period, as St. Columba, as he had traveled from Ireland and started moving north on his way up to Iona, was stopped on Islay. And there is a cross, the Cadalton cross, which is one of the finest examples of Celtic crosses in the world today. If you go to the end of the road past Ardbeg distillery, you can see the Cadalton cross. Around 800 AD was the Christian period ended, and that was when the Vikings, as they started to come from Scandinavia and move southward along the west coast. And you actually see some influence in the name. Name Laphroaig means the hollow by the bay. That Laphroaig, that ick ending in Laphroaig means bay, as in Viking, Vic means bay. And so Laphroaig is a combination of the Celtic and the Viking word origins. We got tired of the Vikings by around 1200 AD. Somerled, the King of Scotland, who was situated as the Lord of the Isles, again, talking about the central location of the island of Islay. He was based at Finlagan, which was this lake castle, this loch castle on the island of Islay, and was able to move about the country easily, being located on the sea on this island. By 1500 AD, the Islay estates were passed on to a Sir John Campbell of Cawdor. The Campbell name is a name that has a long history on the island of Islay. Our distillery manager at Laphroaig today is John Campbell, and actually is the same Sir John Campbell of Cawdor. There can be only one, right? Live forever. Now, so I'd mentioned earlier about getting over to Islay. 20-minute flight from Glasgow if the plane can land, or you drive 2.5 hours to ferry at Kennaicraig and then hop on an ocean-going vessel. Now, back in the day when the Simpson family and the Johnson brothers were traveling from Islay back to the mainland, they were sailing, similar to the ship that you see to the top left. If they could get across at all, the storms, they blow up very quickly and very dangerously. And if the currents are right and the winds are right, you can make it from Islay to the mainland back then in about a day's sail. But as I said, very treacherous, and you needed something to calm your nerves and settle your stomach, take away the queasiness. So the Johnson brothers, when they were traveling back to the mainland, well, they would say, well, what you need to cure that queasiness is a Dramamine. And that's where the term Dramamine comes from. Nope, sorry, that's a load of BS. I'm making that one up. There's some truth to this evening. There may be some BS as well. You'll just have to figure out which is which. Anyway, so the speed of commerce picked up in the mid-1800s when the steamships came into play. They straightened the winding ways of the winds. And so you were able to get the grain to the island and get the whiskey off the island much faster. Today, when you come, and I always recommend driving, it's a beautiful drive to the coast, and then hopping on the ferry, which is the Caledonian McBrain ferry that you see on the top right. That'll carry about 40 passenger vehicles and about 300 people. And they have a full cafeteria on board as well as a full bar. So don't worry if you need a little bit of that medicinal Dramamine that I was talking about. They've got it on hand, on deck. When we look at the island of Islay, we look at the crest of Islay, which pays tribute to the Lord of the Isles, which is the sons of Donald and Angus of Islay, Fili Donaldsy Sangus de Islay. And this crest is Somerled, the King of Scotland, atop the 9 waves. And legend has it that if you can put 9 waves between you and your enemy, you will never be caught. Well, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're going to go beyond the 9th wave to access the other world and the Blessed Isle. Now, if you feel like you've over-consumed in the other world, the Blessed Isle, please make sure if you're somewhere else that you need transportation, that you've got a designated driver or rower or sailor to get you home properly. We want to make sure that these are strong spirits, and we want to make sure that you get home safely or get to bed safely, because we're looking forward to seeing you again in the next time. So as I mentioned, here's the island of Islay, about 20 miles by 25 miles across, 320 days of rain, 45 days of sunshine. And you can see how with this satellite map, how the storms kind of wrap around and hit along the southern portion of the island, where you've got Laphroaig, Lagavulin, and Ardbeg. And then between you, the Islay Sound is between Islay to the left and the Isle of Jura to the right. And we were talking about the Corryvreckan. For those of you, one of the largest whirlpools in the world is located at the northern tip of the Corryvreckan, of the northern tip of Jura. But Islay itself, if you look at what looks like somebody's putting their thumb print on the island in the center section, that section there is where we have what's called Loch Indal. Loch meaning a lake, as in a sea lake. Indal means in delay. So it is a natural harbor. So when the storms were raging out in the open sea, the ships would sail into Loch Indal and anchor until the storms passed, and then move back out onto their journey again. So it made sense that the first village on the island incorporated would be on Loch Indal, and that village is Bowmore. So you see Bowmore. Bowmore is the largest village on the island. Port Ellen at the southern tip, just out where Laphroaig is located, is the next largest town. But Bowmore is the village. It's also the name of the distillery itself. You see 8 of the 9 distilleries on this map here. Laphroaig, half a mile down the road, you've got Lagavulin. At the end of the road, Ardbeg. You drive into the central portion of the island, you've got Bowmore. Across the loch there, you've got Brooklady. The only inland distillery is Kilcoman, and that is one of the newest distilleries that dates back to the 1990s. And then up to the northeast, you've got Bunnahabhain, and between Bunnahabhain and Kalila is the newest distillery, Ardnahoe, which technically they do not have any whiskey yet because it hasn't been 3 years. They just started producing last year, and so by law it has to age at a minimum of 3 years before it can legally be called a single malt Scotch.
Hey, Simon, while you had that up, could I interject with a question?
Absolutely, yeah, perfect timing.
If you could bring that map up again, down there in the south, you had Laphroaig. Yeah, perfect. Laphroaig, Lagavulin, and Ardbeg as near neighbors. We had a question here. What friendly or competitive relationships does Laphroaig have with its neighbors, Ardbeg and Lagavulin?
Yeah, well, you've got to realize, and particularly this time of the year, the island gets locked in, it gets shut down because the storms can rage for 2 to 3 weeks on the island. And so we can be a very isolated island. So there's a lot of sharing that goes on this island. If something breaks down, the boys are going to go down the road to see if the folks at Lagavulin or the folks at Ardbeg or have got a spare part. There's a lot more. The community does a lot more sharing. Of course, on the global aspect, Laphroaig, Bowmore is part of Beam Suntory, whereas Lagavulin and the likes of Kalila are part of the Diageo group. So it's very competitive, more competitive that way from a corporate level. Where it really gets competitive is the football matches between the town of Bowmore and the town of Port Ellen. That's when you see the true allegiances between the central part of the island and the southern part of the island. And there's regional differences on the island of Islay. As much as there are regional differences in Scotland, as I was showing earlier, the southern part of the island is really kind of where the big boys are, the real bigger, heavier style peated whiskies. You get into the central part of the island, and the peat's going to back off a little bit more with the likes of Bowmore and Brooklady. And then you go up to the northeast. Bunnahabhain is, some of the expressions are unpeated. So there's stylistic differences even from region to region on the island of Islay. And we're going to get into even stylistic differences from warehouse to warehouse at each of the distilleries a little bit later on.
Great, thank you. I think I delayed your moving into the tasting, so don't let me delay you anymore.
Absolutely. Okay, here we go. Yes. So let me have a sip. Our first whiskey of the evening, Bowmore 12 year. Now the age on a bottle of single malt Scotch is the age of the youngest whiskeys that go into the bottling. So this whiskey, this bottling will contain 12, 13, 14-year-old whiskeys. We're probably not going to go much older than that because we have a 15-year-old Bowmore, and so we're going to be saving those older casks for the older expressions. But generally 12, 13, 14 years old. Now, the question always comes up then is that, well, isn't that a blended Scotch? No. A single malt means it's made out of one distillery, pure malted barley, distilled in copper pot stills. It does not mean it's coming from a single barrel. There are single barrel and single cask expressions, but it's very difficult to maintain consistency if you were to bottle it one barrel at a time. It would also be wildly expensive, but it's that inconsistency. So that is really the key. We want to maintain the same flavor profile. So similar to the way blended Scotches are going to pull different distilleries' spirits and blend them together to create a cohesive flavor profile, we're going to do the same thing with single malt Scotch. We're going to use 12, 13, 14-year-old whiskeys. And this way, we're able to create a recipe that we can maintain and repeat year upon year upon year. Now, this 12-year is 90% bourbon casks and 10% sherry casks. And what I mean by that is that for basically every 9 casks of bourbon cask Bowmore, we're going to pull 1 sherry butt of sherry cask, marry those together, and then add water, bring it down to a bottling strength of 43%. Have a nose of that if you haven't already, if you haven't drunk it already. And when you nose it, a couple of things: get your nose into the glass, part your lips. I'll demonstrate like this. For the other side. Because when you nose a whiskey with your mouth closed, you're getting full alcohol. It numbs the senses, anesthetizes your nose, and makes your head kick back. Now, you might like that experience, but for the sake of getting more of the layers of the spirit, breathe into your nose with your mouth open and switch nostrils, not with your neighbor, just from left to right, because one does tend to be more sensitive than the other. And take the time to nose it as much as you're going to take the time to savor it when you're tasting it. It takes 12 years to make this. I ask that you take more than 12 seconds to enjoy it. And during that time, you're making new friends, you're reacquainting with the old. It's about the spirit within the spirit. So now, when we go to taste, here's the other tip. The tendency you sip at the front of the mouth. Where else would you sip? But when you're sipping at the front of the mouth, not only you're getting the sweet, which is fine, but you're also getting the heat. The alcohol sensors are in the front part of your mouth. So when we taste this, I'm going to ask you to place the glass more towards the middle of the tongue. This way it's going to bypass those heat sensors. You're going to get more of the flavor, less of the burn. So let's have a toast, all right? This is the first whiskey of the evening. This is our first Islay whiskey of the evening. Islay is the name of the island. It's a Gaelic word. It means the island of Ireland. Simple folk, don't beat around the bush, but it's a great way to remember the region, because a lot of folks will say to me, Simon, is it Islay? Is it Islay? Just remember, Islay means island, and you got the pronunciation of the region. So here's the toast. I must go down to the sea today, to the lonely sea in the sky, and all I ask is an Islay cask, and the friends to drink it dry. Slanja. Also, I neglected to mention, hold it in your mouth and give it a swirl. Hold it, swirl, hold it, swirl. Because each of these whiskeys you're going to taste in different parts of your mouth. I don't like to talk about tasting notes, because I was at a tasting once where the presenter was saying, was really getting very waxing poetic with the tasting notes, and he getting his nose into the glass and, oh, this is like my grandmother's Bible on a sunny Easter morning in the sunlight. And And I looked out into the room, and the people are looking wide-eyed and their mouths agape and thinking, oh, it just smells like whiskey to me. So we don't want the tasting notes to intimidate. But so the thing I like to recommend is exploring the dynamics of the taste experience. How does the whiskey move in you? How does it move you? Because each of these whiskeys will move a different way. Some of them will kind of roll straight to the back. Others will dance around on the palate. And I'm lucky enough in working with the master distillers that when we're sampling out of the warehouses, they'll sample hundreds a day. Now they're nosing them. They wouldn't make it to lunch if they were actually tasting. But when it comes time to tasting, we'll add water and bring it down to 20% alcohol. 20%. That's a lot of water. But that way you find the depth of the spirit. So didn't mention it before, but all of these whiskeys will take water differently, and they'll take water differently for all of you out there. So I would suggest if you find that it's a little bit too hot, add a couple of drops of water to it. And like dew on a rose, it opens up the bouquet. And give it some time. I also recommend pouring your samples, letting them sit for a little bit, because I compare single malt Scotch more to wine than any other kind of spirit. When you talk about the provenance, you talk about the terroir, and Islay is certainly, we'll talk about that shortly, the terroir of these spirits. And it will open it up. At a certain point, it does become dilution, but all of these whiskeys will take water differently and take water differently for all of you out there. So that's the Bowmore 12-year. There are some citrus, lovely lemon zest notes. Great ways of pairing this one. Because we're using the 90% bourbon casks, this is fantastic just to drizzle a wee bit of this over some vanilla ice cream. Oh, brilliant. Or if you want to go the other direction, we have a tasting called the Bowmore Oyster Luge, which I've done actually. We've had some great events up in Boston doing the Bowmore Oyster Luge, where you take an oyster, a fresh oyster, you sip the brine, and then you sip the whiskey. So you'll see how the brine influences the flavor of the whiskey, and then you eat the oyster, and then pour the Bowmore into the oyster cup, the oyster shell, and then luge on. Fantastic. The original shot glass, right? And there are fantastic oysters, great seafood off the island of Islay. Kevin, do we have any questions before we move on?
Oh, indeed we do. Let's see. I'll pick one that's relevant to what you're talking about right now. Besides those in the Beam Suntory portfolio, what are your favorite whiskeys to enjoy when you're not working?
Well, with outside the Beam Suntory portfolio,
Correct.
I used to love a good beer, but I've stopped drinking beer. But it makes sense when you think about all these single malts are just distilled beer, which is an interesting way to for folks who are not big single malt whiskey drinkers. The transition from beer to whiskey is actually pretty easy, and as using the tips that I was mentioning as well, either by adding water or enjoying it as a cocktail. We were talking about Talisker earlier on. It's one of my favorites. Glenfarclas is fantastic. I was also talking about Campbelltown, and there's a beautiful, great old-fashioned distillery, Springbank, in Campbelltown as well. That is just a testament to what's one of the last family-owned distilleries, and it's a testament to the Mitchell family.
We had another question. Why would you finish such a traditional Scotch in a cask from an American product? Why taint it with American product? Simon?
That's a great question, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later. So when we're talking about barrels, so I'll hold on to that question and answer it later if you don't mind.
That sounds perfect.
Cool.
I'll give you one more. What is your fondest Burns night memory?
Woof. Well, considering Burns night this year, I'm doing 7 of them. Burns night for me is just a great celebration of Scotland. I have to say, being in Edinburgh on a Burns night is really quite magical. It is a beautiful city, and really the doors are open to the city. And it's just after Hogmanay, which is New Year's Eve. For those that have never celebrated, that's another great time to be in Scotland. But Burns Night really is a night that it's all about the friends and good friends and family, and that's one of those evenings in Edinburgh that was really very special to me.
Hey, Simon, would you mind just telling people a little bit more about Burns Night? Because I think a few people might be a little unsure about what it all is about.
Yeah, absolutely, Tucker. So we January 25th. So this Monday is the celebration of Robbie Burns' birthday. He was born 1759, January 25th. So this is his 262nd anniversary of his birth. The poet laureate of Scotland. He was known as the ploughman's poet. He was born in Alloway in Ayrshire, in the southwestern region of Scotland. He to a very poor family, and he eventually fell in love. Jean Armour was one of the loves of his life. She had 7 children by him. He was a prodigious poet. He was a prodigious lover. And at the age of 20, he made his way to Edinburgh. His poems were produced in Edinburgh at the age of 20 in 1779. He wrote, you know him mainly because he wrote, he popularized Auld Lang Syne, Coming Through the Rye. He really was, he helped to usher in the Romantic movement of poetry. And I'll give you a little Burns. This is Scotch drink. Let other poets raise a fracas about vines and wines and drunken Bacchus, and crabbit names and stories rack us, and grate our lug. I sing the juice Scotch bear can mack us in glass or jug. Oh, thou, my muse, good old Scotch drink, whether through wimpling worms thou drink, or richly brown bream, or the brink in glorious foam, inspire me till I wink and sing thy name. Fortune, if thou but give me still hale breeks, a scone, and a whisky gill, I'll routh and rind to rave at will. Take all the rest and deal about as thy blind skill directs thee best. It's a wee bit of Burns for you. And we celebrate on the 25th with a supper. And the traditional supper, there's a gathering, and there is the address to the haggis, which is piped in with the address. And then from there, you've got the immortal memory in honor of Burns. And then you've got the address to the lassies and the reply to the lassies. There may be a recitation of Tam O'Shanter. And of course, the evening is finished with drink and dance and more drink. So, and Burns, interestingly enough, one of the largest Burns celebrations that happens in the world is in Russia. They really love and admire Robbie Burns. And it's a great opportunity for us to celebrate all the best of Scotland. A man's a man for all that is one of his other great poems, talking about the strength of man. All right. So here we are on Lochindal at Bowmore. This is, Bowmore has the distinction of being the oldest licensed distillery on the island of Islay and the second oldest licensed distillery in Scotland. And you'll notice the distilleries are located on the island, on the shore, because that was the easiest way to get grain in, get whiskey out. Whitewashed, painted the whitewash actually serves as a beacon. The white of the distilleries cuts through the gray of the fog, and so it's easier to see the distillery to be able to know where to sail into. And one of the unique features for Bowmore is that the number one vaults, which is the oldest licensed Scotch whiskey vaults in the world, is located below sea level. And that comes into play when we look at our production of our whiskey. The history is very important for us at Bowmore, being dating back to 1779. These are some of the lads who were digging the peats out in the peat bogs and bringing it back to the distillery to dry the barley in the process. The village of Bowmore, as I mentioned, was established in the mid 1700s, and one of the first buildings built was the church. It's a circular church, very reminiscent of the mash tuns in the production process, which are circular. But there's also a very sensible reason that there's circular, is so there's no corners for the devil to hide in. And when you come to visit the church, there's a plaque on the inside as you enter that states, "For the study of piety and the culture of truth and honor." Well, the locals would have nothing of the devil in their church, so they chased him out of the church. He ran directly behind me, down the hill, and jumped into a barrel at the Bowmore distillery, which is for the study of irreverence through spiritual enlightenment. Bowmore, located on the sea. One of the things we liked that is key for us at Bowmore is the balance, because a lot of people think that the Islay whiskeys are going to all feel like getting hit over the head by a flaming log. Not true, and that comes into play with a couple of reasons for us at Bowmore. One of them is we use more sherry casks generally than Laphroaig does. Laphroaig uses more bourbon barrels, and bourbon barrels highlight more smoke. Sherry casks, the sweetness of the sherry cuts the smoke, and you're going to get a little bit less of the smoke, more of the sweetness of the sherry. As well as the warehouses themselves. And this is the number one vaults. Below sea level, if you look to the right along the wall along there, there you'll see a water line, because there are days when the sea crashes against the side of this warehouse, and there'll be standing water in the warehouse here. So how does that affect our whiskeys? Well, if you think about this climate, this environment, compared to the rick houses of Kentucky. And in Kentucky, you get much hotter summers and much colder winters. So what happens is the barrels, they breathe, they expand and contract at a much faster rate compared to cool, damp Scotland. And then you come over to Islay, cooler, damper Islay, it really slows things down. Also, because we're using used barrels, there's also already moisture in the casks. American bourbon goes into new American spirit, goes into bourbon barrels that are first time used. So they have a higher absorption rate. But that cooler, damper climate really slows time down for us, slows that breathing of the barrels in and out. So that's what allows us to be able to age our whiskeys 12 years, 15 years, 30 years, 50 years, because it's almost as if you're in a mausoleum. It stops time, and it impacts the whiskey much gentler. And so that allows us that conversation, as there was a conversation between the copper and the distillate, there's a conversation going on between the wood and the spirit, we like to call it the long sleep. We're not going to rotate barrels. We're not going to move barrels. We put them in there. We leave them there. We don't touch them until they're ready. And ready for us brings us to our next whiskey, which is the Bowmore 15. So you'll notice the color, and there's two images of Bowmore 15 because we are just transitioning from the one on the left, which says Bowmore Darkest, to the one on the right, which just says 15-year. So you may see out on the shelves still some of the Bowmore Darkest bottling from the left. Both bottles are the exact same liquid. Just wanted to let you know. but they've decided to take the darkest off the label. So this 15-year, the color on this compared to the 12-year is darker, and that's because this has more of the influence of the sherry on this. We go 12 years in bourbon cask with this, and then we put into Oloroso sherry for an additional 3 years, and that's going to give us a much deeper influence of the sweetness of the sherry, that full time for 3 years in the Oloroso sherry casks. They are Oloroso sherry casks, and these are reminiscent to the casks that were being used in the 19th century. When sherry was the drink of fashion, the sherry casks were coming up from Spain. We would empty them, and hey, here's a perfect container for us to bring our whiskey to market. We weren't sitting around waiting back then 12 years, 15 years for the whiskey to age, to mature. We were drinking it right out of the barrel, or we were marrying different barrels to create new flavor profiles. And it was coming to market anywhere from 160 to 180 proof. Now that's just the way I like it. For a lot of folks, that's a wee bit too hot. So a lot of shopkeepers, what they were doing at the time, they were blending teas for their customers. So what they thought they could do is blend these different single malts together and then add into that a neutral grain spirit that was being made through a different kind of a distillation. Single malts made through a batch system, one batch at a time. So, but a new kind of distillation, a column still, a coffee still, Irishman by the name of Aeneas Coffee designs a still, which you can shovel in grain, a corn wheat mix, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year, you can make this neutral grain spirit. You add that in with the single malt, and that was the birth of blended Scotch. Those early shopkeepers blending teas, that was the Dewars family, that was the Walker family. And for us at being Suntory, that was the Teacher's family. Teacher's Highland Cream blended Scotch is a blended Scotch, a blended whiskey. When Scotch really came into its own was the 1880s. The drink of fashion was brandy and soda, but the phylloxera plague wipes out all the vineyards of France. So there's no grapes available, so there's no brandy available. So that's when Scotch and soda became the drink of fashion. And because the British Empire stretched throughout the world, that's when Scotch really took off. So we'll raise a glass to the beetle here this evening. Otherwise we'd be drinking whiskey, drinking brandy, and I'd much rather be drinking the whiskey. So let's have a taste of the Bowmore 15, shall we? Let's have a toast. We're gonna have a toast to the Spanish and their sherry casks. Otherwise we wouldn't have this whiskey. And it goes something like this. Saluda, dinero, amor, il y a tempo para conquistarlo todo. I have no idea what I just said there. Hopefully health, wealth, love. If I said it right, time to conquer all. If I said it wrong, time to conquer the bull. Salud! Right away, mouthfeel on this is different. It's a little bit oilier, a little more viscous. And that's the influence of the sherry casks on this whiskey. A little chewier. If your audio was on, I'd hear a lot of lip smacking at this point. But this Bowmore 15 really, it literally is a sweet spot for me. I really love this whiskey. I think it's one of the core range. It's one of my favorites, and a favorite globally. Any questions out there?
Simon, there's a couple folks in the audience who are sipping the 18 instead of the 15. Can you just give a 30-second snippet about the 18 and how it might compare?
Absolutely. The 18-year is a higher proportion of sherry casks to bourbon. So they're all a minimum of 18 years, but we're using a higher percentage of sherry to bourbon casks. And as you start moving to the 18 and into the 20 plus years, the influence of the number one vaults, that damp, cool environment starts pulling out some tropical fruit notes. So the fruit notes, which are more kind of the dark raisiny, apricot fruit notes that you get in the teenage years at Bowmore, as you start moving into the 20s and you're on the edge, those fruit notes start becoming tropical, pineapple, mango. Now we're not doing anything with the barrels. We're not adding anything to it. It's just one of those beautiful mysteries of life that really brings out and enhances the depth and the complexity of these whiskeys. I I'm always amazed when people say, "Oh no, the single malt Scotch is not a drink for me." I think I can find a single malt Scotch for everybody out there, because there's such a range of flavors and experiences. And it might mean adding water to it. It might mean having it as a cocktail, but there is such a range of flavors. You just have. I just say you haven't had the right one yet. Haven't found the right whiskey for you. All right, moving right along. We're moving now from what's called from Lochindal, and we're going to move down to the Cairdeas parish. That's the southern part of the island. It's known as the Cairdeas parish. We're going to cross, as we head across the island, we'll pass the airport, and along the way, you'll also see all of the peat bogs. The peat beds along the way are mostly located in the lowest part on the island. There's a lot of similarities between Bowmore and Laphroaig, obviously being both on Islay, but we both peat our barley during the malting process. Size and shape of the stills are going to give the heavier, oilier body. We're maturing on the sea, the warehouses by the sea, and of course the people. Being an island of only 3,200 people, there is a communal aspect to whiskey making on the island. Everybody's related, right? So now this is Laphroaig on the one sunny day of the year, and as I was mentioning, you can look south from the distillery and see Ballycastle, Northern Ireland, 35 miles away. You'll see off to the south there, county. Oh, sorry, we got a little technical glitch there. Anyway, we're back. So what you see, I'm going to go back here. The three rows of windows that you see there are the malting floors. That's where we're growing the barley. And at the far end, the right end, you'll see a little bridge, and that's where the water source for Laphroaig is located. Water is a key component, as I'd mentioned before, and it's every distillery has its own water source. And if you come to visit, and when you come to visit, I always recommend calling ahead because whiskey tourism has become very popular these days. And chances are you can show up and probably get in on a tour, but it's best to call ahead. And I'll take people up to the water source in the middle of the summer, the Kilbride Dam, and it'll be a mud flat. So historically, that's what we call silent season. There's not enough water to make whiskey, so the boys would go shut down, go work the fields until the rains came, and then once the rains came, they'd come back and start making whiskey again. So this is the way they would transport the whiskey by horse or by horse and cart back in the day. These are what we call quarter casks. Laphroaig has a bottling called quarter cask, which is a smaller barrel. Two men can lift a quarter cask and put it onto the side of a horse and bring it to market. So much of what we do at these distilleries is based on centuries-old traditions. And this is Laphroaig the rest of the year round, and that's why we drink the whiskey the way we do and make the whiskey the way we do. Laphroaig means the hollow by the bay. And here you see the hollow by the bay. The number one warehouse is where it says Laphroaig right there. Right behind that, you see three roofs. Those are warehouses as well. And then if you look up to the far left, you'll see on the top left corner, you'll see four roofs as well. Those are warehouses. We call them the road warehouses, and the ones down by the sea are the shore warehouses. There is a microclimate at the distilleries. So it's a damper, cooler warehouse down by the sea, and up by the road, it's slightly drier, slightly warmer. And that's where, if we want more wood influence, we're going to age our whiskeys up in those warehouses. If we want more distillery character, we're going to put our spirit in the barrels over down by the shore warehouses. The water is going to come from Kilbride Dam, which is located up to the far left corner. It's going to flow down and right under the maltings where you saw earlier on. All right, it's time for Laphroaig now. The 10-year-old. Again, 10 years. This is a minimum of 10 years that have gone into this bottling. There's 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old whiskeys that are married to create the flavor profile that is 10-year-old whiskey. If you want a pure 10-year, I would recommend 10-year cask strength. This 10-year bottling, the standard, we take 250 barrels, we marry them. It's going into a marrying tank that's got 20% of the last batch. And then we add water, bring it down to bottling strength. But if you want that straight out of the cask experience, I would suggest Laphroaig 10-year cask strength. We're going to take 100 10-year-old barrels. We're going to marry them. We're going to do what's called barrier filtration, which is just taking out the chunks of wood, and then we bottle. And each batch from year to year is a different strength. So that's definitely worth checking out if you like the bigger, bolder style. Speaking of big, bold style, Laphroaig 10-year, have a nose of that one there. Oh, now we're getting more of that medicinal, that iodine notes. I'll show you another way of nosing the whiskeys. You go into the warehouse, you want to get a sample out of the barrel. You have what's called a copper dog or a copper thief. In the wine business, they call it a wine thief or a valanche. You knock the bung out of the bung hole, insert the copper dog, draw off your sample, put it into your glass. But if you don't have a copper dog or you don't have a glass, the other way of nosing the whiskey is this. You put your hand over the opening of the barrel and roll the barrel a wee bit. So put your hand over the opening of your barrel, get a good seal on it now, and roll it. Get your palm wet. The wetter, the better. Now, palm wet, glass down. Rub your hands together, get some heat going, some friction going. Get it nice and hot. Open the doors to the warehouse. Open the barrel and welcome to Laphroaig. There you go. More of the wood notes this way, more of the sweetness. You also notice that it evaporates very quickly. If we were to do this with a cognac, your hands would be very sticky from the sugars, but all the sugars consumed during fermentation. So another good reason for drinking the single malt. No bad sugar hangover, no carbohydrates, so it's Atkins friendly, good for diabetics, cure to the COVID. No, it's not. Please do not. That's not true. That's part of the BS. And only 62 calories. Now, if you are driving, please wash your hands before you leave. I do not want to be responsible for a night in jail. Honest officer, I was just rubbing it on my body. The man on Zoom told me to do it. Okay. It's time for our next toast. Okay, and this one, because we're using bourbon barrels, and this goes back to the question about bourbon barrels. The American whiskey industry, the bourbon industry, are by law only allowed to use a bourbon barrel once. So perfect for us in Scotland. We're thrifty Scots. Send them over to us, we can reuse them. So they send them over, and really it provides a beautiful foundation for us for the smoke at Laphroaig. Bourbon barrels highlight more smoke, but you're also going to get vanilla notes and caramel notes from the vanillins in the wood sugars and the caramelization of the wood sugars. So here's the toast. And this is one I stole from my good friend Freddie No, from the great grandson of Jim Beam, and I adapted it a little bit to make it a wee bit more Scots. So it goes like this. May there be no hell, and if there is, I'll see you at the bar. Cheers. Oh, that's raw, brecht, moonlight necked material. Gotta love that, right? Now, if you're finding it too heavy, add some water to it. Add as much water, add a couple of drops. It's going to open it up. You're going to get a little bit more of the sweetness to it. But there's also that earthy quality, that deep earthy quality. Where does that come from? Oh, that comes from the peat. But before we do that, It's time for all of us to sing. Okay, you know the melody. We've had a few now. It's time in the fashion of Burns. We're all going to do a little song here, and I'll start it off. And it'll good start note. All right, ready? Here we go. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The taste of Laphroaig will never fool ya. It's a garbage can on fire. The smell of burning tires. It reminds me of my home. Phew! Oh, that sounded fantastic. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Now, this song is not a comment on your home in the current lockdown situation. I'm not commenting on your home in any way. But there is that gritty quality to this whiskey that some people love. And there are other flavors in this whiskey. And where do those flavors come from? They come from the sea, they come from the land, they come from us malting our barley. Kevin, I'm going to ask if there's any questions that we, now that we've had a whiskey and we've sung and a little bit.
There was a little bit of a questioning about the age statements, and kind of two questions in one. Can you talk more about kind of how whiskeys evolve with age, and do they always get better as they get older? And then what's the deal with these non-age statement whiskeys that we see coming on the market now?
Great question. Non-age statement whiskeys. So we've got one, the last one of the evening we'll be tasting is Cairdeas. We've also got the likes of, and I mentioned before, Laphroaig Quarter Cask. There's no age statement on that. Laphroaig Select. No age statement whiskeys are actually more historically accurate to the way whiskey was bottled and sold back in the 19th century. As I mentioned earlier, they weren't sitting around waiting 12, 15 years back then. But the way age became important in a historical perspective was, so all these distilleries in Scotland in the 19th century are producing their whiskey, their single malt, primarily for blending purposes. 99.9% of the whiskey being produced was being sold to blenders and being sold for the likes of the classic blended scotches. And this continued so even through the 20th century, early 20th century, up until the World War II. World War II, the industry shuts down. Some of the distilleries stayed open to produce industrial alcohol for the war efforts. But after the end of World War II, Winston Churchill decides he wants to stimulate the economy. He wants to make Britain great again. He had much bigger hands. And so what he decided was, let's get all the distilleries up in Scotland. Let's get them all up and running. Let's stimulate the economy. And so as a result, by the late 1950s, the early 1960s, there was literally a whiskey lake in Scotland. There was so much overstock of single malt, the blenders didn't know what to do with it. And so that's when two distilleries for the first time started promoting single malt Scotch as a category for the first time. Second half of the 20th century was when single malt started becoming popular. And those two single malt distilleries, Glenlivet and Glenfiddich. And that's why they are as big as they are today, because they were the first two really to promote and capture that opportunity. And think about the stocks that they had. They had been shut down early 1940s. So they had all this older spirit. So they are promoting these older whiskeys, 18, 20, 25-year-old bottlings, because they had a lot of that stock around. And of course, we lose, compared to America, the bourbon casks, and when they're aging, they're losing 3 to 4% evaporation. We lose 2% in Scotland. We're stingy. We're not going to give it up. But no, actually, because cooler damper, there's less evaporation. But because of that, there is more liquid. 18, 20, they had more liquid from that period, and they sold it. And it is rarer liquid because there is less of it due to the evaporation. So they are saying that 18, 20, 25 is more exclusive. Does that mean it's better? Not necessarily so. And I think, I think 10-year Laphroaig is a great example. It is a dynamic single malt Scotch. I think it is in its prime at 10 years old. Now, the longer it's spending in the barrel, you're going to get more of the influence of the wood. And for some folks, they prefer that. If you let it go too long in the barrel, it's going to be too much of the wood. You ask the boys at the distillery, they like the younger whiskeys. They like to taste what they made. So it's really a balance. And it is unique to each distillery, to each warehouse, to each barrel. And so it really is, there is a huge range of styles and flavors from distillery to distillery and even within each distillery. I hope you're finding that by tasting the 12 versus the 15 of Bowmore. And as we move on to our last whiskey with the Cairdeas, there is a particular style, but there's a range of flavors and versatility within each range of style of flavors. Okay, and how is flavor influenced? Well, one of the ways is Laphroaig and Bowmore are two of the 6 distilleries that still do floor maltings. That means we're going to soak the barley, 7 tons of it for 2 days. That starts the germination. And then we lay it out on the floor and let it grow for 6 days. By the end of 6 days, it's got the consistency of sprouts, has little rootlets. So we need to stop the barley from growing. We need a fuel source, a heat to dry the barley. And that fuel source for us is peat. What do you call a 2,000-year-old Scot? Peat. What is he talking about? I don't know. Peat is just decomposed vegetative matter. If we were to leave this in the ground for another 500,000 years, it would become coal. So it's the top layer. And Islay being windswept, there's not a lot of trees, so there's not a lot of fuel sources on Islay. So as a result, the early man discovered that by digging peat out of the earth, and that's not early man, that's Callum. Peat's on the left, Callum's on the right. He's just an old man. And he's one of the peat cutters who hand cut 200 ton of peat a year at Laphroaig. He's showing you the section that that we cut out of the earth and use at Laphroaig. We're going to dig the top section above his top hand. That's still green growing vegetation, no good for us for the fire. We're going to dig the next 18 inches that you see there and stack it out on the floor in the field. And then below his lower hand, they're going to cut another 18 inches. That's going to be a hotter fire. That's closer to coal. That's what the locals will use to heat the homes and cook with. But it's that 18-inch section that we use at Laphroaig to dry the barley. So we dig it out in the field. We let it cure after harvesting 4 months out of the year. By the fall, it's dried enough to be able to use to heat your homes to cook with, but most importantly for drying the barley. So the barley's been growing for the 6 days. We're going to shovel it into a chute that takes it into the kilns, and in the floor above the kilns here, the fires will burn and the smoke will go up through the floor, drying the barley, stop it from growing. Now, the difference between Bowmore and Laphroaig is Bowmore gets a hot fire going, Laphroaig gets the fire going hot, and then they let it die down and it smolders. It's what we call a cold smoke peat. Think barbecue, think low and slow, and that's absorbed into the barley differently than on a hot fire. And so that's why you get so much smoke at the top of the taste with your Laphroaig whiskies. We'll then take the barley, grind it down into a fine grist. We'll add hot water, we mash it. That's called wort. And then we add yeast and ferment. Sound familiar? Basically, we're making a beer, right? That's all single malt is distilled beer. But fermentation allows us to pull out a lot of the fruitier notes, depending on length of time that you are fermenting. So here you see the flavors, the different ways that you can influence flavor in the malting process, fermentation, distillation, and then finally in maturation. But in distillation, those copper pot stills really there's something magical that happens in this step of the process. We have 7 stills. We have an uneven number of stills, 3 wash stills and 4 spirit stills. The wash stills are in the foreground on the right, the spirit stills in the far left. This conversation that happens really pulls out a lot of the sweeter notes. Yes, there's sweet notes, there's floral notes, as well as the smokier notes. But copper is a beautiful element. It's very reactive. It pulls a lot of those unwanted impurities out. It's about the thickness of a copper penny, and it will, with the rolling boil, it will wear away at the sides of these stills, and to the point where you could poke your finger through it, and then it's time to replace it. And we replace it in sections because different sections will wear through because of the concentration of heat. But that new make spirit, that hot new spirit, coming off the still comes off clear, so we need to soften it, round it out, adding the character, and that's where the wood becomes such an important part of the production process. We use Maker's Mark bourbon barrels at Laphroaig. They are a great partner. They've been a partner with us for over 30 years now. The quality of the casks are the best, so we can really predict how the whiskeys are going to age. So this brings us to our last whiskey of the evening. I would ask you, how do you pronounce this whiskey? And it's pronounced Cairdeas, exactly the way it's spelled, right? No. Cairdeas means friendship in the Gaelic language. Our distillery manager, John Campbell, it was his grandmother that actually named this one. Cairdeas is a bottling we do for the Islay Whiskey Festival. Every year, we have a gathering. We didn't last year, and we're not doing it again this year, unfortunately. The island goes from 3,000 people to almost 10,000 people. We're hoping to be able to have it back online again by 2022. Every distillery celebrates through the whole week, and we do special tours, special tastings, and special bottlings. And Cairdeas is a yearly bottling we've been doing since 2008. It's been available in the US around since 2012, 2013. And actually that 2013 bottle was a port cask, which plays into this bottling here, because we took those casks after 2013, we put whiskey into them again and let them age for another 7 years. Side by side, we're aging in bourbon for 3 years, and then an additional 5 years in a Chateau Lagrange Bordeaux wine cask. And then we marry those barrels for a short period of time. And that is what gives us our Cairdeas 2020 port wine and cask. Have a nose of that one there. Now, in comparison to the 10-year, certainly the red fruits become a lot more prominent with this. All right, and this one is bottled at 52% ABV. So this is going to be the strongest of them all. I would recommend trying it neat first and then adding a drop of water if you need to add some water to it. So here's the toast. This is to friendship. This is one my grandfather taught me, and it goes like this. Here's teus, ne like us, God dead, which translates to here's to us. There's nobody else like us. God damn the rest. Cheers, Slanja. Big fruit notes on this one. Finishes with the smoke. Are you getting, there's a little bit of tannic dryness from the wine casks, and quite a difference from the 10-year. Yes? I'll take that as a yes. These are limited bottlings. Each year you'll see a Cairdeas bottle. You'll see a different label. So they're one-offs. So, and I believe that, well, as you got samples, there are still currently samples in the Northeast, in the Massachusetts market. These are beautiful bottlings, but they do go quickly. And once they're gone, that's it. They're gone for good.
Hey, Simon, speaking of gone for good, I think we have a lot of concerned folks tonight regarding peat, wondering if it's a renewable resource or if it will ever run out. And does that mean that Laphroaig could run out? Is there any way to kind of continue producing peated whiskeys if it's not renewable?
Yep. So that's a great question. It is, when you talk about every inch being 100 years of decomposition, it's basically non-renewable. We have enough peat on Islay for the next 500 years. So your Laphroaig and Bowmore is safe. And certainly the practice is hand-cut peat is more sustainable than machine-cut peat. Because what we'll do, and I'm going to go, when we cut in, we take that top section, we put it off to the side, and then we dig below that, and then we take that top section and put it back down on the ground again. So when you're driving across Islay, you'll see what look like sunken football pitches, and that's because we've taken that the basically 36 inches out, and then taken the top and put it back down on the ground again. So it continues to grow, regenerate, and eventually become peat again. The other way that we've been able to reduce consumption is, you saw the bricks of peat. There's also what is called the CAFF, C-A-F-F, which is the dust, the shavings of the peat. And what we're able to do is soak that and put that on the fire, and that cuts down on the use of the actual bricks of peat themselves. And over the last 10 years, we've been able to cut down our use of peat by 30%. It is definitely one of the key factors for us on the island is sustainability. Energy sustainability. We do not have any wind farms directly off Islay. One of the things that is being investigated and explored and experimented right now off the island of Islay is wave energy. There's a number of turbine stations off the island that are looking to utilize the wave energy. And a number of years ago, there was talk of having Islay sustainable through wave energy by 2050. It's looking a little bit more challenging these days, but certainly if we can harness that energy, we'd be set in terms of our energy use. Any other questions there, Kevin?
I'll let you continue on with the Laphroaig part here.
So we have a program called Friends of Laphroaig, and we're just to give you an update, we're going through a relaunch of Friends of Laphroaig because we've had it since the 1990s. It's the old system was a little bit clunky, so we are just in the process of relaunching the program. But the idea behind it is that there's a brochure in every tube, which the code on the brochure entitles you to a square foot of land at the distillery. So you come to visit your plot, we're going to put you in a pair of welly boots like these, give you a flag from your country, shove you out into the field, and you go find your plot and stake your claim for your clan, your country. It's a great program, keeps you in touch with what's going on in the distillery, and you get invitations to come to events such as this. And when you come visit your plot, you also claim your rent, which is a miniature of Laphroaig. And if the economy tanks here, you got a place to live in Scotland, right? But to show you how ardent our fans are, and if you're geographically challenged, you can GPS it now, so it'll tell you exactly where to find your plot. But to tell you how rabid our fans are, let me just see. Yes, we invited as many Friends of Laphroaig to a gathering a few years ago, and 300 people showed up. 10% of the population of the island of Islay showed up. And everybody got a pair of boots and a flag and a glass, and we all marched out to the field. We got photographs of everybody on their plot. Spelled out F-O-L in people. For a while, it looked like F-U-L. The old group couldn't get them together, but finally we got them together because that was sending the wrong message, and got this photograph. But there was a gentleman from the Pacific Northwest who was a lifelong friend of Laphroaig, who had passed away the year prior. And one of his wishes were that his ashes be spread on his plot. So as ambassador, I carried his ashes across, and we spread his ashes in front of 300 friends of Laphroaig and raised a glass to his spirit. To me, that speaks to the passion that people have for this whiskey, that they will travel the world and beyond for a dram of the finest. So we don't call it Pete anymore. We call it Larry. Ba-dum-bum. All right, I'm going to go back here for a sec because it's time to sing again, ladies and gentlemen. I know you've been dying to do it. You know the melody. Right? Yes, you know that one. But it gets a little tricky at the very end there. So we're going to practice it first. We love Laphroaig when it's in our glass. If you don't like it, well, kiss my association with you. Laphroaig's the booze we choose. Got it? Okay, here we go. We've come from the cold and frozen north for booze, for booze. And Laphroaig is the whiskey that we want. We choose, we choose. We love Laphroaig when it's in our glass. If you don't like it, well, kiss my association with you. Laphroaig's the booze we choose. Yeah. All right, there we go. All right, now to get serious. We are the only distillery that carries the royal warrant of Prince Charles. It is his favorite whiskey. The 3 feathers on the bottle, that royal warrant recognizes sustainability, contributions to the community, and quality of spirit. So it is an honor that bestowed upon us, which is we do not take lightly, and are honored to be able to carry that warrant, being the only distiller in Scotland to carry that. It rains a lot in Scotland. We get a lot of rainbows. The pot of gold is the end. At the end of that rainbow is Bowmore and Laphroaig. As we start to finish up, I'm going to finish with one more song, and it goes like this. My ship lies at anchor. I soon now must dock. I wish you safe journey without any shock. And if ever we should meet again by land or by sea, I will always remember your kindness to me. So here's a health to the company and one to my lass. Let's drink and be merry all out of one glass. Let's drink and be merry, all grief to refrain. For we may or might never all meet here again. Slanja. All right there, Kevin.
All right. Taking it to the other side of the world, what's your opinion on Asian whiskey, especially whiskeys from Japan, Taiwan, and I'll throw India in the mix as well?
Well, I'm going to stop share here. Being that we are owned by Beam Suntory, I am a huge admirer of the Japanese whiskeys from Suntory. They are a style and a whiskey unto their own right. There's a lot of Scottish influence in the whiskeys, that the single malt style of production. I'm a big fan of and actually the whiskey that got me excited about Japanese whiskey was the Hakushu heavily peated bottling that I tried a number of years ago, because it reminded me in some ways of all the best of the Islay style of whiskey. But there's also, we have our other distilleries, the Yamazaki distillery. Really, there's a huge range of styles and flavors. And I don't think they are copying what we do in Scotland. I think they have created their own niche, their own style, which has been around since the 1920s. It is not something new. The folks in India, Paul John, Rampur, Those are really lovely style whiskeys. A little bit more challenging in terms of production just because of the climate, and also the Indian whiskeys tend to be a little bit more mainstream, just because in terms of the flavor profile, it goes better with a lot of the spice dishes rather than doing the big spicy whiskeys along with the spicy Indian food. They tend to cancel each other out. So you have a good base of a good solid whiskey, and then add that, and then the spice comes with your foods. And Kavalan, great Taiwanese, really fantastic. I think the whiskey industry worldwide, of course, the last couple of years, it's been a little bit more, the last year, it's been more challenging due to the pandemic. But it's been very difficult for the smaller distilleries. And so we wish them all the best in terms of production and staying afloat. But I think, and in the United States, there's amazing whiskeys being produced across the US. I think you're going to see, if we don't already have it in the United States, I think you're going to see in 20, 50 years, regional styles to the American whiskeys as well. Pacific Northwest versus Kentucky versus Tennessee versus Colorado. The way the whiskey is produced at the altitude in Denver is more similar to the way we produce our whiskey at Ardmore in the Highlands because of the elevation. So there's some interesting parallels, interesting similarities, and I think it's all good. There's no bad whiskey.
I mentioned at the beginning of the event that Laphroaig 10 is the Scotch that got me into Scotch. And actually, when people ask me what my favorite whiskey is, it's often not a Scotch. It's the Yamazaki 18, which I was enjoying back in 2010, 2011, when you could find it on the shelf for $100. And now it's unobtainium. So I think you have a couple of phenomenal whiskeys there in the portfolio. Kind of along the lines of the regional differences you were mentioning in Scotland and elsewhere. Someone asked, what are the best Scotch tasting tours in Scotland? Could you recommend, if somebody were to put together an itinerary in Scotland, what you would say are the must-sees?
Well, there is what's called the Malt Whiskey Trail, which as you travel about Scotland, if you're driving, you'll see signs that have got the pagoda chimney icon on the sign. So that means that's part of the Malt Whiskey Trail, which means that they have a visitor center and that they're open for tours. I would say give yourself time when considering touring the distilleries in Scotland. We get people who come over to Islay for the day thinking they're going to visit all 9 distilleries. It's not going to happen, folks. I would basically, as a rule of thumb, I would give yourself a half day for each distillery. And that's something you can do on Islay because they're so close to each other. But guaranteed that you may have a packed schedule, but you'll get to one of these distilleries and you'll get chatting with the operators at the distillery, and suddenly the morning is turned into afternoon and it's turned into a whole day at the distillery. And that's not a bad thing. We encourage you to come and spend time with our folks at the distillery. And I'd also like to point out, total staff, operational staff at Laphroaig is 17 people. At Bowmore, it's 20 people. People think these are big factories. These are old farms on an island off the coast of Scotland. They are small operations, and it really is a point of honor for me and for the operators to travel the world and see on a back bar a bottle of Laphroaig 10 or a bottle of Bowmore 12 coming from this tiny wee island. I also want to give a shout out to Emma Boyle, who is one of our newest operators at Laphroaig. She is the first female operator in Laphroaig's history. We did have a woman running the distillery from 1954 to 1967, Bessie Williamson, but she was a distillery manager. Emma is the first operator. She's making whiskey, and she's been at the distillery for 5 years prior to, and great to have her making whiskey as well, and I'm working with the team. If you're looking in terms of tours, you can. I always find it's better to venture out on your own if you can, and when you're at the distillery, also explore around the distillery, because the environment around the distillery is going to shape how the whiskey is made. You know, get your hands in the dirt of the around the distillery. Get your hands in the grass and in the muck, and just kind of really absorb everything that's such a key component that makes all of these whiskeys successful. Yep, I'm seeing booked a private tour with a driver that drove us around for 8 days. That's a great way of doing it, because again, you're consuming alcohol, and we're very strict in Scotland regarding the drunk driving laws. So you need to be very careful about that. Of course, you can always walk on Islay.
Or crawl, as the case may be. Actually, I'll give you the last question that we have here at the top. It's very apropos that you brought up your first female operator. There's a question about, are there any female distillers? And I'll just add on to that. Could you talk about the rising prominence of women in the Scotch whiskey industry?
Yeah, one of the earliest distillers was from the Johnny Walker days. Elizabeth Cummings was her name. It was purported that she had an illicit still and worked with a local farmer making whiskey. And when the taxman was coming, she would put a red flag out to notify the distillers, the illicit stillman, that the taxman was coming. And that's kind of the story of Johnny Walker Red, was from Elizabeth Cummings. I did mention Bessie Williamson, who had actually come to Islay in the 1930s, came for a holiday, and one summer got a job as a secretary to Mr. Ian Hunter. And but she also had a chemistry degree from University of Glasgow. Mr. Hunter recognized her potential and her skill set, and he took her under his wing and tutored her, mentored her. Eventually, when he passed, she took on the managerial position in 1954 and ran it till 67. She stayed on an extra 5 years after Laphroaig was purchased by a larger company, to make sure that the quality, that the standards at Laphroaig were maintained, and that the spirit was being maintained. It is a male-dominated industry, but there are some key women in the history of Scotch who need to be recognized, and Bessie Williamson is the only female distillery manager in Scotland in the 20th century. Today, we have quite a few more distillers in Scotland, female distillers. Diageo has got, we had a female distillery manager at Lagavulin, but she is now moving over to Port Ellen to reopen the Port Ellen distillery in the next couple of years. And women have long played an important part in the blending process. One of the key master blenders in the industry still today is Rachel Barry. And her nose is one of the best in the industry. And she has worked with a host of brands, from Ardbeg to Auchentoshan to Glengarry, and now she's working with another company. But very important. Women have long been an important makeup of the Scotch production. It's great to see more and more as the face of the brands as well today.